QSO Today, Episode 309, Carl Lutzelschwab, K9LA. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver and a whole host of parts and kits for the ham radio builder. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. We continue to work hard on the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo coming August 8th and 9th. We are planning on combining radio with the Expo by having talk-in channels on DMR, D-Star, IRLP, All-Star, System Fusion, and Echolink. If you'd like to help out by being an official greeter on one of these systems, you will have access to the convention platform a week early for training. My hope is that if hams have any problems with getting on board, help is just a radio call away. My hope is that by adding the radio component to this virtual experience, it will enhance it the only way that amateur radio can. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. While I am busy with my team on the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, I'm reprising some of the older episodes of guests who will appear as speakers in the Expo. Carl Lutzelschwab, K9LA, is one such speaker who was interviewed in episode 37 of this podcast 5 years ago. Of course, Carl's story is timeless, but now the audio is remastered by Ben Bresky. K9LA, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Carl?
Yes, I am. 4Z1UG. This is K9LA. How you doing, Eric?
Great, Carl. Thanks so much for joining me on QSO today. Can we start at the very beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I'm sure my story is like many others of my era. I'm 67, so I was licensed quite young in my early teens. But my first recollection of radio was Mom and Dad bought me a little crystal radio set, and I'm pretty sure it came out of a Sears catalog, so I could listen to the local radio stations in the Chicago area because I grew up in northwest Indiana in Hammond. So that's my first recollection of radio. And then, like many others, I got into shortwave listening. I'm not sure how that happened, but I think one of the triggers was at an early age, probably in fourth grade or so, I started reading the Hardy Boy books. And one of the books there was called The Shortwave Mystery. And I think that probably piqued my interest in, listening to international shortwave stuff. And Dad must have figured something good might come of this. So probably in fifth or sixth grade, he bought me a National NC60 receiver, which was a typical 5-tube receiver of the late 50s and early 60s, and that opened up the world of shortwave listening to me.
Did you have that in your bedroom so you could listen to it at night while you were trying to go to sleep?
Unfortunately, no. It was down in the basement, and when you're a little kid, and the basements are kind of scary a little bit, but it was in the basement, and I spent a lot of time down there, listening to all the BBC, Radio Moscow, and Australia and everything else.
So when did you get your first license?
Okay, I was licensed in October of 61. What happened was there was another book in the grade school I was in. It was called SOS at Midnight. It was authored by Walker Tompkins, and he wrote a series of books, but SOS at Midnight was the first one in his series. And it was about a teenager who was a ham, and he had a DX100 and all kinds of interesting stuff. And I think that's probably what really got me going into amateur radio. But probably like many other people, okay, so I was aware of ham radio, but how do you get into it? Well, it just so happens that my 7th and 8th grade social studies teachers, Mr. Walters, was W9MNO, and he had a radio club. I was very anxious to get out of 6th grade and go into 7th grade because of the radio club. I guess you could consider him my Elmer. And I joined his radio club at school, and he had a station in the classroom. The building was kind of U-shaped, so you had a wire running between, the two wings. And I can remember him making CW QSOs. Of course, I didn't, know the code that good when I first started. Eventually, he administered my novice test, and I got my license, WN9AVT, in October '61.
And from there, you were involved in ham radio at school?
Well, there wasn't a club in high school or anything, so it was kind of me on my own. Of course, getting on the air, I managed to meet a lot of other locals in the Northwest Indiana area. And I think it was probably about April '62, a bunch of us took the train to downtown Chicago. And we all took our general and passed, and that opened up even more opportunities in ham radio for me.
And your call sign
was WN9AVT, and then I turned into WA9AVT.
Do you remember your first rig?
Yeah, my first rig, of course, was the shortwave receiver that Mom and Dad bought, the National NC60. And my first transmitter was a Heathkit DX35 that Mr. Walters loaned to me, since I didn't have anything else available. I don't know why I didn't build something, because that was a pretty big thing back then, but I didn't. So I got a DX35, and that allowed me to talk to a lot of people.
What kind of antenna did you put on your house, on your folks' house?
We lived in a residential area, and we lived across the street from a nice big park. But I had a dipole running from the house to the garage, just a 40-meter dipole. So 40 meters was my major band as a novice and early general. I did get on 80 a little bit. 15 meters was kind of a problem because the NC60 didn't have an RF stage, so it was a little bit deaf up there on the higher bands. So I didn't work too many people with the NC60 on 15.
Did amateur radio have an impact on how you chose what kind of education you had or your career?
Yes, it did. I guess, I can't say I got into amateur radio to pursue a career. It just kind of happened. But once I got into ham radio, it was just obvious I would head to Purdue University and be an electrical engineer, and that's what happened.
So you became a BSCE from Purdue University?
Yeah, I stayed another year and a half and got my MSEE also, and took advantage of W9YB, the Purdue Amateur Radio Club, and had a good time.
And what happened after that, professionally?
Well, after that, I did a 2-year stint in the U.S. Army. Had a good time there. I was stationed in northern New Jersey and ran the Mars station there. They had a 2-element quad on a nice 60-foot telephone pole, so that worked good for amateur radio too, not just the Mars stuff. And then after school, I started basically with Motorola in Schaumburg, Illinois, with their land mobile division. That was in '74. Then in '79, I transferred down to Fort Worth, Texas with Motorola. And that was a good move because it allowed me to buy the first house and put up a tower and all that kind of stuff. In '77, the FCC allowed extras to get 1x2 call signs. That's when I picked up K9LA. That was my second choice. And it's turned out to be a good one, I guess, in retrospect.
What did you do in Motorola in the land mobile division? That was a very exciting time that you were there.
Yes.
I know that when I first got into ham radio, my interest was Motorola surplus radios. You perked my attention when you said that you had worked in Schaumburg. What did you do there?
Yes, well, I always wanted to do RF design, and that's what I did, RF design. And for some reason, I ended up going into power amplifier design, RF power amplifiers. And that's basically what I did throughout my whole career until I retired in 2013.
So the RF power amplifiers that you designed in Schaumburg, can you mention any of the radios that those amplifiers might have gone in?
Yeah, they went in, started with the Mitrek radio, Centaur X. And I think that was it because in 1988, my wife Vickie and I decided that our two boys needed grandparent influence. So that's when we moved back north. And that's how we ended up in Fort Wayne.
And what did you do in Fort Wayne?
Well, I ended up going to Magnavox. It went through several name changes. Now it's Raytheon. But I basically did the same thing, designing RF power amplifiers. The big difference was for Motorola, it was commercial type stuff, the radios that go in police cars, fire trucks, cabs, all that stuff. Whereas here in Fort Wayne for Raytheon, that's a defense company, so it was power amplifiers for the defense industry. It was a good run. I enjoyed it. Of course, Motorola in my early days was a ham haven. It was great. There were a lot of hams there, and just the camaraderie, I'm sure, helped Motorola, and they had a very good policy about, hey, if you want to build something, just go down to the stock room, get some parts, and build it, because we think that you building something is going to help your performance at work. So
I think that was a very smart policy for Motorola. Israel's oldest American company is Motorola. Motorola had an R&D center here, I think, in 1962.
I wouldn't doubt it. Yeah, I seem to remember Motorola Israel when I was working for Motorola. We didn't really do too much with them, but I was aware of it.
I think the hams at Motorola were the ones that actually invented cellular telephony and almost all of the advances that came through Motorola.
Yeah, Motorola was a big player back then.
Especially with the hams, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah. If you got a job with Motorola, it was pretty good. What's
your favorite operating mode?
Oh, I'd have to say probably CW. I enjoy it because of my the roots in my novice days when you had to get on, it was a CW or a 2-meter FM, and that was it. I enjoyed HF because of who I could talk to and all over the states. I really, in the early years, didn't get too much into DXing because my station was pretty modest, but it was the entry level into, what I think is a lot of fun.
What kind of rig do you operate now?
Okay, right now I have I should say we, because my wife is Alpha Echo 9 Yankee Lima, AE9YL, and she gets on too quite a bit, although we're busy doing other stuff. But we have a Ten-Tech Omni 6 and a Commander amplifier. It's a single 3CX800. And we've got a couple towers, nothing massive, 60-foot towers, some monobanders and Tennodyne log periodic to cover 20 through 10. So it's a modest station, but
very modest antenna farm with a log periodic on the roof.
Well, it's only it's only a 6-element log P, so it's not a big thing.
For most hams, your modest antenna farm is to die for.
Yeah, I would guess that. Yeah, there are a lot of people with less, but it's just what you want to go after, I guess.
If CW is your favorite operating mode, do you tend to use some kind of a bug, or what's your favorite form of sending CW?
Well, the easiest, of course, is with electronic keyer. I do enjoy using the hand key. Just this last February was the first annual Novice Rig Roundup, where it's kind of a very relaxed contest where you're supposed to get on and make QSOs with your novice or general era rigs, essentially the 50s, 60s, etc. So I got on for that, had a really good time, used my my old Viking Ranger 2 and a Hammerland HQ170 and a hand key, and had a ball for that week, and I plan to do it again next year.
So you still have that old gear. Do you restore old gear? Do you have a workshop in your house?
Well, the workshop is a bench, kind of a bench here in the room with the radios and the computer and a lot of bookcases of all kinds of stuff. I also have an NC60. It's not my original one. I have a DX35. It's not the original one. And I have a couple other vintage rigs, an SX100, a World Radio Labs Globe Chief. They need some work, so I need to get to those. And it's pretty easy to work on the old stuff with tubes because parts were big, and I could actually read. I can still read the color codes on resistors because they're big. It's quite a bit different nowadays with chip components that are very small.
Yeah, even quarter-watt resistors now I have to use one of those circular fluorescent lights with the magnifier to be able to see the colors, yeah?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're just getting old. Don't worry about it, I guess.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get out and be active with ICOM's new IC705 and its optional multifunction backpack. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion, as it has many of the same base station features and functionality of ICOM's bigger rigs. At the tip of your fingers, in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilo, or just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. The ICOM IC705 has a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall, similar to the IC7300. I can't wait to get my IC705 to use as a baseband rig for satellites and microwave projects, including the S-HALE geosynchronous satellite. The ICOM IC705 puts out 5 watts with its BP272 battery pack and a full 10 watts when connected to an external 13.8-volt power supply. The rig does single sideband, CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Other features include micro USB connector, Bluetooth and wireless LAN over Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, a micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment. As this is the perfect QRP or QRPP rig, the perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional LC192 backpack with its special compartment for the IC705 and room for accessories for SOTA activations or just a day social distancing in the park. For more information on this fabulous new rig, click on the banner in this week's show notes. And when you go to buy your new ICOM IC705, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. You brought up the fact that your wife's a ham. One of the questions I always ask is, how did ham radio impact your family life? So it sounds like it might have impacted it positively, yes. But how did that go?
Yeah, well, Vickie she was interested in radio before we met. But she had the problem I mentioned before. You know, she was aware of ham radio, but she didn't know anybody to help her get into it. So it kind of just, sat in the background till we met. And then she, got her, at the time it was her novice, then her tech, eventually her general, and then her extra. And of course, we enjoy doing things with radio, and that really lets us travel. And it's pretty interesting because, you can go to pretty much anywhere in the world. And if you're meeting a ham, you have pretty good, lots of confidence that, it's going to be a good experience. So ham radio is really a great way to meet people around the world in person.
It makes you international ambassadors, essentially.
Right. Yeah. So we've been on several expeditions. In 2001, a bunch of us went to Damascus in Syria, and we put K9LA on the air. That was a lot of fun, and of course, we all had lots of misconceptions about Syria. They're fairly westernized, but of course, right now things are a real mess. So it's probably not a good place to go to at the moment. Probably couldn't get a license anyway. But I remember Vickie's interested in lighthouses. So she's a member of the Amateur Radio Lighthouse Society, and she mentioned one day that she wanted to go operate from a lighthouse. Well, we could have went to, some little lighthouse up in Michigan or something, but we went to Market Reef, OJ0, which is a little reef between Sweden and Finland. So we operated from there for a couple days, and we had a great time. And again, the two fellows we were with were, just great. Ham radio is a great way to meet people from everywhere. That's what I can say.
I agree.
Yep.
Do you have children that also got interest in ham radio? Or?
No, we have two boys. They were mostly interested in sports. They never showed an interest in radio, so nothing.
Well, if it makes you feel better, I have two boys who have no idea what I do down here.
Oh, okay.
Even after almost 30 years, they have no idea what goes on down here.
Well, they know that we do a lot of... We go to a lot of conventions and ham fests and all that, and that's about it.
What's Vickie's favorite operating mode?
She likes CW, but mostly she gets on sideband. She doesn't use CW enough to really feel comfortable with it. She likes sideband. She likes the 10-meter contest, too, so that's one of her favorite playgrounds, I guess you'd say.
One of the primary reasons that I asked you to come on to QSO today with me was because you have an understanding of propagation that probably surpasses that of most hams. So if we could actually go there now, for the radio amateur, what is propagation?
Well, propagation is just trying to understand how a signal gets from point A to point B. I think my interest in propagation started when I was a novice, because I can remember going over to one of the locals' house, K9WQS, Bud. He had a tower and a tri-bander and an amplifier, and of course, me being a novice at the time, that was top of the line. And I can remember on a Saturday morning, one of my other novice buddies and I went over there, and he called CQ on 15 meters CW, and a JT in Mongolia answered him. And I think that might have sparked, well, how in the heck did that happen? How does a signal get all the way from Mongolia to northwest Indiana? So I think that's what sparked my interest. And I had quite a bit of interest in propagation throughout college, but, Purdue, not too many schools offer stuff in the way of propagation in the ionosphere. So it kind of sat in the background until the boys grew up and we didn't have to, coach baseball, soccer, football, etc. And that's when I think I really started getting back into propagation, when they got old enough.
So in your study of propagation, what are the resources that are available now in order for us to understand propagation, and I'm assuming which band to select, what are the maximum usable frequency, things like this?
Yeah, well, with the internet, of course, there's just a whole bunch of stuff available.
Where do we start?
One thing we don't do anymore is listen to the bands. We seem to be so busy, and a great way to gain an understanding of propagation is just to get on the air a lot on the various bands. And if you can't do that, well, there's all kinds of websites that say what the maximum usable frequency is worldwide, which should give you an idea. I'm struggling here because in the remaining time, it'd be hard to explain propagation in any detail.
Maybe I'm making it more complicated than it is. I know that the way that I kind of get a sense of whether a band's open or not is depending upon the time of day. I'll kind of go through all the bands and I'll hear what I can hear and whatever's just noise. And then if I make a mental note or I write in my journal that 20 meters is dead as a doorknob, 40 is also dead in the time of day, then I have some sense that maybe there's some kind of pattern here. 40 is great at night, but it's, it's okay during the day, but it's very local during the day.
Yeah, there's some general rules of thumb, I guess you could say. For the higher bands, follow the sun. In other words, the sun is needed to make the ionosphere stronger, and that allows the higher frequency signals to refract. So we're talking about 20 meters through 10 meters. Those are essentially daylight bands. The lower bands, 160, 80, 40, and 30, they're essentially nighttime bands because of absorption in the D region. So those bands you'll operate generally at night. Another general rule of thumb is where we are in a solar cycle. If we're around solar maximum, the higher frequencies are better. If we're around solar minimum, the lower bands are better. So there are general rules, and of course, like you said, you listen to the band. There's also a packet cluster, which is a system that, if I hear a station in Israel, I can put out a spot that says I'm hearing Israel on a certain frequency at the certain time. And of course, if you log on to a packet system, you can see all these spots from around the world, and you can kind of, judge what's open, what's not open, and how the bands are doing that day. So there's a lot of resources out there.
So a packet cluster is like a bulletin board?
Yes, bulletin board with people who've heard other stations, yes.
Now, about 2 weeks ago, we had a huge solar flare. Ham Nation now has a lady that reports on solar activity.
Is that, I forgot her name. She's a PhD.
Yeah.
She has a web TV every week, and she gives solar conditions.
That's
Very
right.
excellent report.
I don't remember her name, but she is amazing. Yep. The question I have is, when we have a huge solar flare, how does that affect propagation?
Well, there's really three types of disturbances to propagation. Mm-hmm. The first is a geomagnetic storm, which generally is the result of a coronal mass ejection, a big explosion on the sun, or a coronal hole where the magnetic field on the sun is kind of open and it sends out material towards Earth. And what those two things can do is disrupt the Earth's magnetic field. Now, mm-hmm. since the ionosphere is immersed in the magnetic field, that's going to cause the ionosphere to be affected. So in general, if we have a big geomagnetic storm, the bands are degraded. That's one of the disturbances to propagation, a geomagnetic storm. Another one is a solar radiation storm, and that comes if there's a big flare concurrent with a coronal mass ejection. If there's a big flare, it can send out very energetic protons, which funnel into the polar cap, which causes absorption for over the pole paths. So that's not good. Then the last one is a radiation storm, which is a big flare can also send out lots of electromagnetic energy, not just particles. And that electromagnetic energy can cause increased absorption on the day side of the Earth, which also affects our bands. So those three disturbances can really wreak havoc. They have different time frames of how long they last. For example, a geomagnetic storm is probably the worst because it lasts the longest, and it can be recurrent as the sun rotates around and we get hit again. Mm-hmm. So, that was a really big one. And the lady, spaceweather.tv, so your listeners can go there.
I'll put a note in the show notes page with a link to it.
Dr. Scove, and I forgot her first name.
She's fascinating.
Yeah, she's very good.
If you haven't heard her, click on the link and tune into her.
Yeah, spaceweather.tv, and that'll do it.
When we're at the bottom of the sunspot cycle, what does that mean for those of us that want to operate in the low bands? Does that mean like we might as well just pack up the gear and not use it?
No, from what I said earlier, the solar maximum is good for the higher bands. Solar minimum is good for the lower bands, lower frequencies. So if you base it on that, sure, things will change, but there's always some activity somewhere else you can go chase. Like you said, right now we've just passed the second peak of solar cycle 24. It looks like it's begun its descent. So the higher bands, generally 15, 12, and 10 meters, will be more and more noise as we progress for the next couple of years. Mm-hmm. There won't be much activity there. But that also means, there's a silver lining in every cloud. That means down on the lower bands, there'll be more activity down there on 160, 80, and 40, and 30. And you just have to adjust your operating schedule a bit to take advantage if you want to stay on the air.
So if we're headed into a trough in the solar cycle, then we should prepare to be on 80 and 40 and 160.
Yeah, well, you got to remember that 20 and 17 will probably hold up okay, though. Mm-hmm. So they don't depend on a whole bunch of ionization. So their openings will be reduced, but they'll still be good worldwide bands, 20 and 17. And one of the old sayings that's been around quite a while is if you can only put up an antenna for one band, put it up for 20, because usually everything shows up on 20 meters. And it pretty much holds throughout a solar cycle. So take that as, I guess, a little hint to help your operating habits.
Hey, this is Eric for just another short break. One of my favorite ham radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, hosted by George, KJ6VU, my guest in episode 232, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy take a bi-weekly deep dive into their favorite Ham Radio Workbench projects and the technologies that fascinate them. If you want to be a ham radio builder or just be inspired, click on the link in this week's show notes page.
Yeah, I guess that's one of the things I've learned from doing all these podcasts is that we think that when we come into amateur radio that we should have a 7-band rig or 160 through 6 meters and that our antenna should work on every frequency band. But one of the things that I've learned is that some of the most successful hams that I've interviewed, they'll build an antenna for one band and they'll sit on that band for a couple of years and work it every which way with a lot of success.
Right, yeah, and like I said earlier, that's a great way to understand a band, too. All its idiosyncrasies and anomalies, etc. We used to do that because we didn't have packet to tell us instantly, what's on and what people are hearing. You had to go, sit there, find a signal, hang around until he identified, and then you'd know what was going on. Along the way, you pick up, how does a band sound during the various disturbances to propagation too? Like a geomagnetic storm can cause flutter, whereas the solar radiation storm can cause signal strengths to go down. There's nothing more dramatic, although it's short term, is a radio blackout where just the whole band goes away. And, you wonder, you go out and look, did my tower fall down? Did my antenna fall off? Did somebody cut the coax? But it's just a physical phenomena that happens. And you just wait a little bit, an hour or so, and the bands will be back. So
the sunspot cycle then is something that we just adjust to. It doesn't mean that we're out of ham radio. It doesn't mean It's the end of our, we don't have to wait until it peaks again before we can come back on.
Well, I suppose that depends on your class of license too. If you're a technician, I'm not sure how.
Relying on 10 meters, maybe.
Yeah, then you kind of have problems. But I think techs also have CW privileges on some of the AHF bands, so they can move down there too. Speaking of the solar cycle, this is the 24th one in recorded history. So we know, we have almost a little over, 17, about 300 years of data for something that's been going on for probably thousands or millions of years, perhaps. So it's no wonder we kind of struggle at times to predict what the sun's going to do.
How long is a solar cycle then?
The solar cycles vary, but on average, it's about 11 years. The average rise time of a solar cycle is about 4 years. In other words, from solar minimum to the peak is about 4 years, which then says on average, the decline of a solar cycle takes about 7 years. So a solar cycle rises faster than it declines. And we're just starting the descent on solar cycle 24. If you look at some long-term, if you look at the maximum smooth sunspot number of all 24 solar cycles, you'll see that we've been through 3 periods of high solar activity. And what I mean by that is, there have been 3 periods of several solar cycles that have been extremely high. And we've been through 2 periods of solar cycles that have been kind of low. And where we're headed, it looks like, is several cycles that are going to be kind of low. So that's not good news for the the 10-meter crowd, but that's the way it looks like what's going to happen.
Could be great news for the 160-meter
That's crowd. Right. Yeah, of course, some of the adverse effects is everybody crowds into the lower bands, but oh well. I'm sure some people just get off the air too because a lot of hams have their favorite bands and other things in life going on. So
I have an associate here in Israel. He lives down on the coastal plain. He lives in a penthouse on the top of a residential apartment building. And he ran a long wire from the center of his patio cover down to a tree across the street. And the patio cover was made of tin, so he used that as the counterpoise. And he ran a long wire with an antenna tuner, and he worked 160 meters, and he'd worked all states from Israel.
That's good. That's good.
It's good with a long wire on 160 meters.
Yep.
So
you just gotta turn into a night owl though.
That's right.
But
that's right.
There are things you got to give up, like daytime.
like daytime. I guess the idea then is that as the solar cycle changes, then I guess we can change the goal, what it is we're going to try to achieve with the tools that we have and with the conditions that we have.
Yeah, there's, of course, the ARRL and CQ Magazine sponsor lots of awards. Probably the premier DX award is the ARRL's DXCC. And of course, you can go after 5-band DXCC or even add some more bands. And, one of the things many people have been stressing that it sure looks like the sun's going to go into a somewhat of a quiet period for a decade or two. So hopefully you've worked all the stuff you need on the higher bands, because they're might not be available. Get all your higher band QSOs out of the way, and now start thinking about working on lower bands. Yep.
It actually isn't so bad. I mean, it gives you something to plan for.
Well, that's what's good about ham radio too, Eric, that there's so many different aspects. If you're not into DXing, then who cares about solar cycles really, or too much about awards chasing either. But if you're interested in moon bounce, it doesn't probably matter that much. Or if you're interested in emergency communications, solar cycles don't matter. So there's just so many different things to do in amateur radio that there's always something you can find to do and have fun too while you're doing it.
For the folks that are DXing on the microwave bands, and obviously DXing maybe is not the right word for 400 megahertz and above, but how does the solar cycle affect people who are running single sideband and CW on 400 megahertz and above?
Well, generally the ionosphere is not strong enough to refract those frequencies at that 400 megahertz and above, and it's even rare that it refracts 2 meters and even 6 meters. So the bottom line is the ionosphere is pretty much out of the picture for that kind of stuff, and you're going with moon bounce or satellites, etc., where the only thing you really worry about is the satellite or the moon in view by both ends of the path.
But if you're working 600-700 miles on 2 meters, for example, what are you relying on there? That's not the ionosphere.
Yeah, it's probably the troposphere, where the index of refraction in the troposphere causes 2 meters to bend. And that's probably what causes a lot of those 2 meter long distance QSOs. What you should do there is try to understand weather patterns, terrestrial weather patterns, because there's a lot of tie to that. And there are websites that predict what's the possibility of tropospheric ducting, etc.
Right now, I think there's tropospheric ducting open between Hawaii and Southern California.
Yeah, I can remember. It was probably in the early 60s when QST had an article about it. It was a KH6 and a W6. The first 2 meter QSO via tropospheric ducting between Hawaii and W6. And they made a big deal of it back then, and it certainly was, considering you had to build all your equipment and everything. But nowadays, it's probably a lot easier to do that. You just gotta, be there and say, well, I'm going to take advantage of it.
Do you use beacons in your study of propagation?
Yes, that's another big, really good resource. The IARU, which is the International Amateur Radio Union, joined with the Northern California DX Foundation, and they have 18 beacons worldwide running on 20, 17, 15, 12, and 10 meters. And each one is assigned a different time slot on each band, so you can identify which one's transmitting at a certain time. And right there, each of those 18 beacons transmits for 10 seconds. So in 3 minutes, you can tell how open the band is worldwide. If you hear all of them, wow, things are great. You're probably at solar max and everything's looking good. But there's also some software that goes along with that you can set up with your PC and your radio, so that the beacons are monitored, the signal to noise ratio is monitored, and it can tell you if you're receiving via short path or long path based on the delay. Of course, you have to calibrate out your internet delay and all that stuff, but It's really fascinating. You can collect a huge amount of data in a relatively short period of time. And the biggest thing that I've seen that comes out of all that is the bands are open more than we think. It's just there's nobody taking advantage of them. Of course, we go listen to 10 meters, we don't hear anything, so we turn the radio off. Well, we really should get on and call some CQs and see if you can raise somebody, because the band just might be open, and you may be pleasantly surprised with the QSO.
And obviously, CW has a way of just working its way through the noise.
Yes.
Where single sideband doesn't. So even if the band is kind of lousy, you can get through on CW.
Yes.
Do you operate any of the digital modes?
No, I don't. Well, CW. Yeah, there's a joke there. That is it's 1-0, so I guess it's a digital mode. But no, I don't. I've never done any QSOs on, PSK 31 or anything like that.
Are the beacons CW beacons, or
yes.
are they also?
They're all
also run digital?
Nope, they're straight CW, so you can identify them. Of course, like I said, the beacons transmit at specific times. So if you know what time it is, you know which beacon you're hearing. Of course, you could always identify it, with your ears. And of course, there are code readers nowadays too. So that CW can be decoded and presented on a screen. Well, that's basically what RIDI does.
What do you think is the most important piece of test equipment an amateur radio operator should have in his shack? If you had a choice of choosing one, what would be your first choice?
Well, I think for all around work on antennas and radios and power supplies, I think the first thing is a good voltometer meter. Just generally, checking voltages and checking for shorts or opens or et cetera. That helps. It's very difficult to work on the innards of rigs nowadays because they're a lot of surface mount. So I would have to say, a power meter would be something you should always have. Well, you should know how much power you're running anyway, but that's always good to have. An antenna analyzer, so you can, see what your antenna is doing without putting a large signal on the air. That helps. That's about it. I don't have too much test equipment, just some basic things that I guess they're more aligned towards troubleshooting than digging into a radio and, I don't have a signal generator or spectrum analyzer, network analyzer, anything like that. I've always wanted to, but when I start thinking about it, how much would I really use it? Probably not that much.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. It's my understanding that you have an interest in aviation.
Yes.
Do you do anything in aviation? Well, first of all, you can say what it is you do in aviation, and is there some kind of ham radio link to that?
Yeah, well, there seems to be a very strong link between amateur radio and aviation. I know a lot of guys who were hams and flyers. In my younger days, I was a airplane and instrument flight instructor, and I owned a Cessna 170, so I had lots of fun with that. Did some 20-meter mobile from it, but I haven't. We sold our 170 in 1988 when we moved back north, and I kind of regret that. What I should have done was taken the wings off and stored it until I was ready to get back in. But that's bridge under, or that's water under the bridge. Vickie's always encouraging me to get back into aviation because she really enjoyed it too. We used to have lots of fun with, going somewhere on a weekend with the kids and throw the dog in the back too. And we had a good time with the airplane, but as the kids grew up, they got into sports, and pretty soon we weren't using the airplane, so we got rid of it. And if I did get back in, it'd be more just for pleasure, and that's it.
You don't go to a local flight club and fly now?
No. I should, but there's enough other things going on.
If you were to offer advice to new hams or returning hams, what advice would you offer them?
Well, I'd say that amateur radio is a hobby, so have fun. And that's what I think I'm doing now. I just have fun getting on the air, talking to someone I've never talked to before. Have fun and figure out, what you want to do with ham radio. If there's some certain goals, then certainly go after them. And use the internet facilities, use help from locals. There's always somebody around who would just love to help out, I'm sure. So I guess the bottom line for me is enjoy it and have fun.
Right. Don't take it too seriously.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of people who probably take it kind of too seriously. And, that's when I turn the radio off and go do something else and come back later when I have fun.
There you go. That's excellent advice.
I should just mention is if you are interested in propagation stuff, go to K9LA.us, and that's my home webpage, and I put a monthly feature on every month, and there's all kinds of other stuff trying to explain propagation and why stuff works. There's a lot of stuff we still don't know.
But you've been writing a monthly column, I think, right, in magazines for years.
Yes, it started. I started in 1997 in January with a printed magazine called World Radio. Mm-hmm. Along the way, it went to an online publication. And then a couple of years ago, CQ bought it, and it was part of CQ Plus, which was an addition or an addendum to CQ Magazine. Mm-hmm. But they stopped that because it wasn't profitable. I don't even know if they were breaking even. But so what I've done is I just write something. I continue to write something every month and put it on my website. And I enjoy doing that, and I probably will for a number of years. But there are articles about contesting, DXing, the low bands, the high bands, general stuff.
You have a very nice website, and I've already been through it. So
thank you.
I will put a link to that on the show notes page as well.
Okay,
and,
that'll work.
The listeners can see what you've written and what you've been writing for years because It's pretty complete.
Yeah.
With that, I want to wish you 73. I thank you so much for coming on board QSO today.
Well, thank you, Eric, and 73 to you too.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Carl. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K9LA in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. We have gamified the platform to allow attendees to win prizes donated by the sponsors and exhibitors. You can gain extra points if you register early for your free ticket to the Expo. Click on the banner on this week's show notes page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages or by using QSO Today in the coupon box at checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor any of these episodes into written text, please push the button in the middle of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on a host of platforms, including Spotify, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and the iTunes Store. A list of these services is on the right side of the show notes pages. Stitcher is still my favorite. My thanks to my friend and colleague Ben Bresky, who makes every QSO Today interview guest and this host sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.